Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Positive Relationships chapter, part one. I love this chapter. This is one of my favorites by far. I spent about 10 years teaching the psychology of interpersonal relationships. I love this stuff. It really is my favorite. And so we saved the best for last. Let's talk about ideas of positive relationships. And a lot of what we're going to do here is ask you some questions and then talk about the concepts that are associated with the answers to those particular questions. So we're going to start with this question right here. Do you believe in love at first sight? Well, believing in love at first sight is part of something we call romanticism. Now, a lot of what we talk about in relationships comes from interpersonal relationships in close relationships, dyadic relationships, romantic relationships is what I'm talking about here. A lot of what we get actually comes from marriage and other kind of relationship quality, but married couples tend to be very common in what is studied here for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons why is because it's easy to tell when somebody is or is not married. That is one reason. The second reason is because marriages do tend to have more impact on society at large than do non-married relationships, even romantic non-married relationships. So we know from studies done by government as well as by psychologists that married relationships really do tend to have more of an impact financially, et cetera, on the community in large. And so a lot of this stuff comes from that idea. So in this idea, when we're talking about love at first sight, I'm talking about romantic love at first sight. So when we say, do you believe in love at first sight? The question really comes to an idea of what we call romanticism. There's other people who do not have very romantic ideals. We would call that pragmatism. So romanticism are things like I believe in love at first sight, and that love should always be wonderful, and that I'll never have a fight with my partner. That kind of stuff. That's love at first sight. Romanticism. That's romanticism. Pragmatism says, hey, I'm in a relationship for some pragmatic reasons, for their independence. I understand that we both have to work hard. That kind of an idea is more of a pragmatic approach. Well, your answer to this question about how much you believe in love at first sight and how romantic you are might very well have a lot to do with this question right here. So go ahead and let me know. Do you consider yourself male, female, or other than male and female? All right. Well, turns out that males tend to be more romantic than females. Now, what do I mean by that? What I'm saying is that when you ask something like the question, do you believe in love at first sight? Men are more likely to actually believe this. Now, whether or not women like romanticism is a separate question, but actually believing it as a belief and how you interact with your relationships, men tend to be more likely to indicate that they believe in romanticism than women. And women tend to be more pragmatic in the way they understand their relationships than do men. Now, that is not the same as liking things that are romantic. That's a separate issue, but actually believing it in your own lives and how it affects you, men are more romantic overall, and women tend to be more pragmatic in their relationship ideas. So, tell me about your relationship status. Well, your relationship status, if you're similar to many undergraduate students, about 2/3 of you would be single. By not single, that could be married, it could be in a committed dating relationship, it could be whatever you claim that to be. But about 2/3 of you are probably single, depending on your year, depending on several different factors as well. But about 2/3 of the people in colleges tend to be single. Over the last 30 years, the divorce rate in the United States has, go ahead and guess. Well, over the last 30 years or so, the divorce rate in the United States has actually kind of decreased over time. It hit a peak in the 1980s. 1980s was when we actually peaked on our divorce rate. And it's very close to 50% by most estimates. But in the United States now, it's actually gone slightly down. Not really a lot, but slightly down since the 1980s. And in the 1980s, it was the closest to 50-50 that it's ever been. When we look at this idea of divorce rate and what causes divorce, generally people assume divorce to be a negative thing. And it is true that people who go through divorces, that is considered to be a negative event for most people, right? Most people aren't as happy until about 5 years after they've been the divorce has been finalized, right? So 5 years after the start of problems, and then the divorce being finalized. Then also, when we look at this, we are concerned about divorce rate because it tends to have more impact in the society at large. Like, for example, probably has more impact on children, more impact on finances, the legal system, and those kind of things than other kind of relationship breakups might have. And so that's why there's a lot of studying that happens involved with divorce and marriage in the United States. In actuality, the divorce rate has decreased a little bit. What we find is that this divorce rate is going to be quite different depending on the demographics that you belong to. So, for example, if you are in college right now, and if you're watching this, you probably are in college right now, your parents are less likely to have been divorced than the national average is. So, why might that be? Well, one reason is because they have children, and people with children tend to be less likely to get divorced. That is true. It also seems to be a socioeconomic and educational difference. People with a higher education and socioeconomic status are less likely to divorce than people with a lower socioeconomic status and lower income rates. And so that means that when we talk about a roughly 50% divorce rate, that's not proportionate in all the different kinds of marriage that happen. In fact, first marriages are about 50%, but second marriages and subsequent marriages after a divorce, so if you've been divorced and get remarried, you're even more likely to get divorced than you were in a first marriage. When people get divorced, have they gone through counseling before they get divorced? Well, the answer is no. Most people who get divorced do not go through any form of counseling. Well, why do we care? Why can't they get divorced? Now, I'm not saying that the people can't get divorced. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying here is that divorce does have a toll on families, individuals, and societies that is quite impactful. And it seems that there's a lot of options for improving relationships that people would probably benefit from trying out if it could help their marriage and not have them go through divorce. Now, I'm not saying that every marriage could be saved by going through therapy, but I'm saying that the majority of people who get divorced do not go through any form of formal therapy. And we do know that there are therapies that are effectual if both parties in the therapy are willing to try and willing to actually put in an effort and can learn to improve their relationships. Let's talk a little bit about loneliness, since we're talking about some negative things that happen with relationships. Which age group in the United States is the most lonely? Well, there's good evidence that actually finds that the loneliest age group is actually 18 to 30-year-olds, young adults in the United States. Now, of course, there's lonely people in all of these age groups, but young adulthood tends to be a very particularly lonely time for a lot of people. One of the reasons why this might be has to do with the idea that people who are in young adulthood tend to be more likely to be searching for a romantic partner, whereas earlier they may not have been quite so keen on looking for a romantic partner. At the same time, young adulthood in the United States is often a time of a lot of upheaval in your social network. That is, you often are moving to go to college or live in a different place, etc. And so all of your social connections tend to be in flux during that young adult time. Well, this tends to lead to a lot of feelings of loneliness that happen in young adult years. Unfortunately, there's a lot of indications that people kind of don't expect others to be as lonely as they might feel themselves, and they think that other people are not quite as lonely as they think they are. You remember the idea of pluralistic ignorance? So imagine that you go to a college campus, people aren't normally raising their hand and saying, hey, guess what? I'm really lonely right here. And people aren't normally going around saying, hey, you know what? Yeah, you look like you're really lonely. I'm really lonely too. Let's talk about being lonely. No, you don't do that. You don't talk about being lonely. It's got a little bit of a, stigma. You don't really talk about that kind of thing. Well, studies have found that about 25% of college students are actually very lonely, extremely lonely. So if you are walking around campus, then look around, and about 1 out of every 4 people that you see is probably very lonely. Now, what does this have to do with gender? So we're going to talk about gender, and then we'll talk about the socio-emotional selectivity theory in just a moment. So gender differences in loneliness. It turns out that men tend to be more lonely than women if they are single. So single men tend to be the most lonely. We've talked about this when we talked about ideas of happiness, is that a lot of the interpersonal interaction that men receive in terms of emotional support often come from women if men are high instrumental, meaning they're highly stereotypically male. They just don't share a lot emotionally. And so men, especially single men, tend to be more lonely than single women. While at the same time, men tend to be judged more harshly for being lonely. So we have a stereotype that says that men aren't supposed to be lonely. It's okay for women to be a little bit lonely, perhaps, but men aren't supposed to be lonely because men are supposed to be tough and not care about that kind of thing. The way you find this out is by you just make a description of somebody. So, so John is a transfer student who has only been on campus a few weeks. He's feeling very lonely and is looking for new friends. And then you ask, how much do you like John? Well, then you switch that out and say, okay, instead of John, let's talk about Jane. Jane is a transfer student who's only on campus a few weeks. Jane is feeling very lonely, is looking for new friends. How much do you like Jane? All you do is change the gendered name, and John is more disliked than Jane is, which is unfortunate because we have good evidence that a lot of men tend to be quite lonely, especially in young adult years. The socio-emotional selectivity theory is one that talks about how it really doesn't seem to be age that is driving ideas of loneliness. It does seem to be part of the timeline of life. So we've already talked about the idea that young adults tend to be looking for a romantic partner more likely than other people. Well, what they find is that people, when they get to their older age, right, they are less likely to be looking for relationship partners and more likely to spend time with the relationships that they have already established with close friends and family members. So, for example, someone in their 80s or 90s is probably not looking for a lot of new friends because they want to focus on the friends and family members that they already have and enjoy the experience with them while they still have time to experience. We find that even young adults, if they happen to have a terminal illness, for example, will do similar things. They will focus less on making new friends and focus more on enjoying the friendships and family relationships that they have while they still have time left. Now, this is in contrast to most young adults who are often looking for a lot of friends. Because remember, if you're looking for a romantic partner, often you need to cast kind of a wide net, right? When you need to get lots of different relationships with friends, etc., so that you can figure out which friendships will establish you throughout your adulthood and which ones will lead to romantic partners and which ones will not. Well, that means that generally you tend to make a lot of friends and a lot of social contacts so that you can kind of whittle down to the ones that you actually will use throughout your life. Answer this question. Disagreements are destructive to relationships, true or false? Well, of course, the answer is that they can be destructive to relationships. But if you think that all disagreements are going to be destructive, that means, and therefore you should never have disagreements in your relationship, then you've got a big problem in your relationship. Remember when we talked about ideas of romanticism? Romanticism is closely associated to ideas of what we call destiny beliefs. Destiny beliefs are when people think that relationships are either destined to be good, like a soulmate, or they're just not going to be. Okay? People with high destiny beliefs have poor relationships compared to the opposite, which is this idea of work, right? Being willing to work on your relationships. People who are willing to work on their relationships, realizing that their partner is not perfect and willing to put in the work together to work on the relationship, tend to be more happy. So you go away from this idea of happily ever after, my soulmate kind of an idea, to what I call the metaphor of the dream job. Okay? That your relationship should be like a dream job. It's someone you want to work with. You don't stop working when you're hired on your dream job. That's when you start working. That's when you really start working at the job. And it's a job that you want to perform. You want to work at that relationship. Well, disagreements are part of any relationship. Disagreements happen because we happen to have different motivations. Inside of ourselves, we call these dialectics. So, for example, I want to be successful in my job, but at the same time, I also want to sleep all day and be lazy, right? Those conflict with each other. Well, if that happens inside of a person, then of course they're going to happen between people in a relationship. Of course, you're going to have those dialogue. You're going to have that conflict happening. Couples that find that they can learn how to disagree without being disagreeable, right? To learn how to disagree without being cruel can often have better relationship outcomes. So, how do you disagree without being disagreeable? What does that mean? Well, what am I talking about? Well, let's go ahead and see how we want to talk about this. So, number one, you want to avoid negative things in general. So, you answer this question. In a healthy relationship, how many positive things should occur for every negative thing? So, for every negative thing I do, how many positive things should be happening in the relationship in order for that to even out? Well, the answer is 5. There needs to be 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative interaction. This comes from John Gottman's research into conversations and communication. And a lot of this has to do with communication because communication is like the currency of relationships, right? It's how we interact with each other, how we communicate that we care about and want to help one another. So, in a healthy relationship, what they find is that if you are going to have just a minimally satisfying relationship, there should be 5 positive communication interactions inside the relationship for every 1 negative. Now, 1 negative would be something like an insult or a snarky remark or whatever, a cutting remark or ignoring someone, for example. Those would all be negative things that would happen. Now, for each of those, you should have 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative interaction. So one way to work on the relationship and to try and have good outcomes is to make sure that you minimize the negatives and maximize the positives. Another way is to use something that we call accommodation. And I don't think I have a slide for this, so I'm going to write it on the screen if I can. Oh, great. Accommodation. Accommodation, there's accommodation that happens in a lot of different branches of psychology, but accommodation in relationships is when you react in a positive or kind way when your partner is being negative. So imagine that you are insulted by a relationship partner. It doesn't have to be a romantic relationship partner. It could be a parent, or it could be a friend, or it could be anybody you have a relationship with. So somebody insults you, says, "You're a fat cow." Accommodation means not fighting fire with fire. Not saying, "Oh yeah, well, you're a fat pig." Okay, that would not be accommodation. That's what we call negative affect reciprocity. Accommodation is when you react calmly to that. Now, I am not saying accommodation is not be a doormat and let people do whatever they want. Accommodation does mean, pick your battles, choose when you're going to bring up negative things. But part of accommodation is that you can react in a polite way, saying things, talking about your distaste for what was said. Now, a good way to do this is what we call XYZ statements. Let's see if I can get the pen work. XYZ statements. An XYZ statement is a way of being objective. Now, remember, we want to minimize the negative things. And when people feel like you're accusing them, they feel really defensive and they want to say, "Oh, no, you're so wrong," right? That kind of thing. When we're talking about an XYZ statement, it's a way for us to bring up something that might be going on in a way that doesn't create that defensiveness, negative affect. XYZ stands for when you did X in situation Y, I felt Z. So remember, in this example, your partner called you a fat cow. Okay, you will have several options as how you're going to react to that. One way is you can say, "Oh yeah, well, you're a fat pig," right? And that's not a good way to do that. An XYZ statement you'd say, "Well, when you called me a fat cow," that'd be X, right? When you called me a fat cow, this morning Y in which what the situation. Like this morning at breakfast, for example. I felt Z. So the I felt is what we call an I statement. And the reason why we use the I statement is because I felt is objective. Okay. Instead of saying you make me so mad, right? That's accusatory. I'm creating that defensiveness when I accuse somebody of making me mad. A Z that I felt, it's an objective fact. Now, whether you agree that I should have felt that way is a separate issue. But when you did X in situation Y, I felt Z, those should all be objective truths. When you called me a fat cow at breakfast this morning, I felt sad. That's a lot different than saying, well, you're a fat pig and you're always insulting me, right? That creates the defensiveness. You're fighting fire with fire. So if you're trying to do accommodation, you're trying to not fight the fire with the fire. You're trying to keep things calm and objective. XYZ statement is a great way for you to be able to do that. An XYZ statement is also a great way for you to understand when you should even bring something like that up. If you can't think of what the exact behavior was and can't think of an exact situation when that behavior was done, then maybe you shouldn't bring it up. Maybe you should go take a nap and try and be more objective the next time when you are bringing something like this up. Okay. We need to talk about ideas of interdependence theory. So we talked about social exchange a little bit before, and that's the idea that people expect something in return, right? So reciprocity for something we do. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that, I'm going to charge you for something that you do, but when we talk about interdependence theory, it's based off of a couple of concepts, right? Your outcomes in your relationship. Now, outcomes is rewards minus costs. Now, normally we think about this in terms of like money, but in a relationship, you have lots of rewards and you also have lots of costs that may not be actual money. They may be money, by the way, but they don't have to be. So, for example, when I see my kids smile at me and give me a kiss goodnight, that is rewarding to me. When they break break a chair after they've tipped back on it for the 25th time, that's a cost to me, right? So I'm getting a certain amount of outcome. We can actually kind of plot these out if you want to. So here would be maximum outcomes, and here would be minimum, right? It's supposed to say max, not mox. So maximum outcomes versus minimum. And so with your relationship with any individual, you might be able to plot out on a scale where the outcome is. So let's say the outcome is right in the middle. Okay, so this is where your outcome is. That says outcome. All right, right in the middle. Now, does that mean that I'm happy or sad in this relationship? Does that mean I'm going to stay in this relationship or get out of it? Well, the answer is it frankly doesn't matter where the outcomes are. It matters what you compare it to. So the CL, so in interdependence theory, we have something called CL. That means comparison level. The comparison level is what you expect out of that kind of relationship. So what do I expect? Where do these expectations come from in a relationship? So let's say that it's a dating relationship. So boyfriend-girlfriend kind of relationship. Well, what do you expect out of a boyfriend? That depends on a lot of things. Depends on your own experience. Depends on how many movies you've watched and how many you believe. Depends on what you've seen in other relationships, maybe even your parents' relationships. It comes from a lot of different places. So if some people believe that they should just be grateful to have a boyfriend at all, then their comparison level is relatively low, no matter what's actually happening. Okay. If they think that in a dating relationship, their boyfriend should always buy them a Birkin bag, then their comparison level might be relatively high. The comparison level compared to the outcome. So let's say that the comparison level is down here. CL is below the outcome. That means that the current relationship's outcomes are meeting your comparison level. and that means that you will be satisfied with this relationship. So this could happen even if somebody's getting very few outcomes out of the relationship. If their comparison level is being met, they're still satisfied with the relationship. You may have, for example, had a friend who you felt like their significant other was not treating them very well. And you're like, how can you be satisfied with this relationship? Well, maybe their comparison level, what they expect out of a relationship, is very low. And so they're satisfied not being treated very well. The CL alt is a different thing. The CL alt is your comparison level for alternatives. That means it's what you think you can get from another relationship or no relationships. What are the alternatives to this relationship? So, for example, let's say that the CL alt was above the outcome. What you're looking at here is, remember, satisfaction happens when your comparison level is being met. So in this case, we haven't changed the satisfaction in the relationship. But what we have changed is how committed the person will be, right? How stable the relationship is going to be. Because you could be perfectly happy in a relationship and still dump that person if you've got a better alternative somewhere else. So let's say that you're in a dating relationship, your boyfriend, girlfriend, or whoever it is treating you well, but you could be dating somebody who is a movie star with millions of dollars and just wants to spend all their time taking care of you. Well, that sounds like a more attractive alternative that could be giving you more than what you're currently getting. So even though you're satisfied with your current relationship, you might leave it because you have a better alternative. Your CL alt is above your outcome, and therefore you are in an unstable relationship. So this, what we have plotted here, is a satisfying but unstable relationship. If the CL alt is below the outcome, then that means you don't have a better alternative. That means you'd have a stable relationship. If your CL alt is below the outcome, that is the indication that you're going to stay in the relationship. Whether you're satisfied with what's happening in the relationship is based off of your CL, not your CL alt. Okay, this is a good place to stop, and we'll pick this up in the next video.